back to this Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, anything along those lines, and we try to read the Bible and let it say what it says. We are in week number 6 of our study of Exodus. If you have missed any of the previous weeks, each one of these studies is done sequentially, so it is recommended you go back and start at the beginning and you make your way here. But if you're going to stay with us anyways, we're happy to have you. We are in the part of the Exodus story where Moses has encountered God. Like, he has lived a life where he doesn't really have a home. He's lived between the Egyptian world and the Hebrew world. He's ethnically Egyptian or Hebrew, but he's been raised within the Egyptian royal household. And he gets to a point where he causes a conflict. He clearly identifies as Hebrew still, and he ends up killing an Egyptian slave driver and has to flee for his life. He runs away to the land of Midian and ends up starting over there. And he spends a lot of years in Midian working for his father-in-law, Jethro. And he has a family. He's settled. And last week we saw that he was walking along the desert with his sheep, trying to lead them to a place where there was grass, because this is the Middle East, this is the desert area, so he has to, take his sheep long distances to try to find somewhere where it might have rained a little bit. And he sees a bush on fire, and it's not being burned up, so he stops to look at it. And we looked at the encounter that he has, that God says, come near, but it's dangerous here. Take off your shoes, because this is holy. But come near. So that pretty much brings us up to speed on where we're at today. As always, the context as far as the three things we need to know, the author, the audience, and the agenda was written by Moses. The book of Exodus was written by Moses to explain how God acted on behalf of God's people to all future generations. So that's the audience and his agenda. So again, if you want any more of the context, go back, watch previous weeks, and make your way here, or listen to them if you're a podcast-only listener. That being said, let's go ahead and read. We're going to be in chapter 3, starting in verse 11, and we're going to make it all the way to chapter 4, 17. So there's a lot of reading today, but it's all useful and motivating and something that we can learn from. So let's go ahead and read this. Starting in verse 11, it says, But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, This is the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now, please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that he will let you go, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians. Then Moses answered, But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, The Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? He said, A staff. And he said, Throw it on the ground. And so he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, Put out your hand and catch it by the tail. And so he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again the Lord said to him, Put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, Put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh.
If they will not believe you, God said, or will listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. So there's a lot there. That was a lengthy section. But we see a very interesting interplay between Moses and God. Now, on one hand, you could take this and you could look at the principles of it and be like, yeah, God calls us to do incredible things, and he may. But really what we're talking about is vocation. We're talking about calling, what we do with ourselves. Moses, up to this point, has had a very unique experience with his vocation. He's never been able to continue doing what he expected to be doing the rest of his life, whether it was as a slave when he was 3, whether it was as a part of the royal entourage when he was growing up, whether it was as a shepherd in Midian. He always had his vocation, his calling changed. And so we see here that God again is changing directions with his life. He is calling him to do something different. Now, the idea here is that a calling isn't necessarily something that you're good at. It's not something that you're talented or passionate about. A calling is something you are called to, that there is a master and you are the servant, that you are called to it. We typically think of callings as some kind of internal passion thing that we're just drawn to and we have to go to. And God may use that. He may use the passions and the skills you have. As a matter of fact, I think he normally does. But that's not really the definition of a calling. A calling is being pulled, being told, being sent to do something, whether you're good at it or not, whether you're skilled at it or not, whether you're successful at it or not. You are called to go somewhere. And especially when this is a calling by God, it makes a big difference as to how it works out. Because a calling by God is something that is done when God is with you, right? If we look at the story of Moses and his interaction with God, he makes a lot of excuses. They won't believe me. I'm not a good speaker. I can't talk right. Like, he makes all these excuses. And so what does God say over and over? He says, I will be with you. I will provide the way. I will make sure this works, because on his own, yeah, Moses' excuses were perfectly fair. I mean, he's this guy who 40 years ago killed an Egyptian, was on the flee. Like, how is he somebody that's trustworthy? Why would anybody follow him if he just shows up out of the blue? He hasn't been living amongst the Hebrews this whole time. He hasn't been serving. He hasn't been a slave. He's been out living a relatively better life than the Hebrews. Why would they listen to him? And so God equips him. God gives him what he needs to fulfill and live out the calling that God has called him to. He gives him the 3 tricks, basically. These signs from God, that his staff can turn into a snake and then turn back into a staff, that he can turn his hand leprous and unleprous, and that he can turn the Nile River water into blood. And these are things that we're going to talk about when we get to the plagues, that they're not just insignificant parlor tricks. Like, they have very much powerful meanings to the Egyptians and to the Hebrews. But we see there that God is equipping Moses to do what God needs him to do. And we see that God is being explicit about this when we get to his name. Now, typically, when we get to that line in verse 14 of chapter 3, it's translated as I am. And by all accounts, that's a fair translation. But you could translate it another way, too. You could translate it to I will be what I will be. I mean, it's essentially saying the same thing, that I am. Well, I will be what I will be is saying I am. or I will be. It's essentially the same thing. And I think it might be a little bit better of a translation, because throughout this whole section, if you go back and read it, there's a lot of I will be's, I will do's, I will provides, I will change, I will make, I will. It's God's way of saying he will be with us. He will be with Moses as he goes through his calling, as he goes through what God has placed before him. God is with each and every one of us with the things he calls us to. It's not about being the best equipped. It's not about being the most talented. It's not about having all the answers. It's about trusting that God is going to work through what he has called you to do. You simply have to go. And we see that God even gets frustrated with Moses because Moses keeps making excuses and keeps backing away. And to be fair to Moses, it's understandable that he does. Why would he want to go back to a land where he's wanted for murder? Why would he want to go back to a people who rejected him? Why would he want to go back to either people who rejected him? Why would he sign up to lead a group of slaves in a rebellion, in a revolution against the most powerful nation on the planet at the time? Why would he want any of that? And maybe God calls you to something that you don't want. And that's a principle that we've seen throughout the Bible, especially in the New Testament, that God doesn't always call us to things that are going to be incredibly successful or pain-free or worth it in the end as far as earthly standards go. Your vocation, your calling does not always mean that you'll live a comfortable life. As a matter of fact, more often than not, our calling is talked about in terms of suffering, that we are sharing in what Christ has done, and Christ suffered on our behalf. And so as we get to this section that we conclude with every single week, we look at the parallels in the New Testament, and we see that God calls us to difficult things, that God calls us to things that aren't going to be easy, that we may not survive, but God is going to work through what we do. And we also see that there are times when people reject this calling, probably none more so than the story of the rich young ruler, where a guy came up to Jesus, and he was a leader at his synagogue, his Jewish equivalent of a church. It's not an exact equivalent, but more or less you could think of it that way. He was the ruler of the synagogue, and he shows up and he asks Jesus what he has to do to take part in the age to come and the age that Jesus is going to usher in. And he answers some questions, and he answers them spot on. And at the end, Jesus says, okay, now go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Jesus literally called him to follow him. And the guy went away sad because he was very wealthy. That's what it says. Jesus was calling him to suffer, to give up everything he'd worked his whole life for, to follow him. That's a principle that we need to remind ourselves, especially here in the West, where we work and we strive to make sure that we have a comfortable life, that we have everything that we possibly could need, that we have our retirement set aside. None of those things are bad things, but they might not be the things that God has called us to. That God, he challenges us to share his word, to grow his kingdom. And that requires difficult things. That requires uncomfortable things. And so as you think about the story of Moses and God calling him to lead the people out of slavery, think about your own life. Think about what God has called you to do. Are you living out the vocation that God has given you? That doesn't mean you have to necessarily, leave your job or make some drastic change. But maybe it means you need to go into some uncomfortable territories. Maybe you need to talk to that one person. Maybe you need to start building a relationship with that difficult person. Maybe you need to start giving in certain areas. Maybe you need to give more. Maybe you need to sell some things so that you could do some other things for God. I don't know. I guess this is between you and God. But the point is that you remember what God has called you to do, and you answer it honestly. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful and encouraging. Until next time.